Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Research 411, a talk show focused on sharing best practices and trending research topics delivered by professional staff and prominent UT Dallas researchers from various disciplines. I am Tiffany Willoughby, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research. I will moderate today's discussion. Joining me today to talk about propaganda then and fake news now is Dr. Monica Rankin and Samuel Worthington. Monica Rankin is an associate professor of history specializing in the history of Mexico, Latin America, and U.S.-Latin American relations. She is also the director of the Center for U.S. Latin America Initiatives, which has supported much of her research. She has published numerous books and articles on Mexican history and general histories of Latin America. Her research has been supported by grants from the Fulbright Program, the Roosevelt Institute, the Truman Institute, and the UT Dallas Office of Research. She has organized several study abroad programs in Latin America for UT Dallas students, and she was a 2015 recipient of the Region's Outstanding Teaching Award for the University of Texas System. Sam Worthington is a PhD student in the History of Ideas program with a focus on Latin American history, propaganda studies, and translation theory. Sam is currently working as the CUSLAI Research Assistant for an interdisciplinary grant project focusing on machine learning approaches to the reading and interpretation of propaganda. Prior to enrolling at UT Dallas, Sam worked for over 15 years as a professional translator and an interpreter for state and federal judicial systems. Dr. Rankin and Sam, welcome. Now, Sam, can you speak to the research you're currently working on, funded by the Seed Grant Program for Interdisciplinary Research, also known as Spire?
Yeah, I can, and thank you so much for having us today. None of you attendants can see it, but I have on my lucky T-Mock socks, so I'm sure this will go excellently. I am lucky enough to be working through CUSLAI as a research assistant, but very specifically on this interdisciplinary research that is looking at both propaganda messaging and machine language processing. So with Dr. Rankin, she and I are looking specifically at the activities of the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which was active during World War II. And it was an office of the United States government that was specifically geared towards solidifying the relationship with the Latin American space. We don't think of Latin America as a theater of World War II, as it were, but it was the theater of the neighborhood. This was the theater of alliance and securing trade routes and making sure that Axis influence didn't invade the region. So we're looking at a very concrete example of a propaganda campaign, specifically the publication En Guardia, which was a magazine styled after like Life magazine, high quality photos and images that was replete with propaganda messaging. Join our side. Get on the bandwagon with the good guys. We're going to win. We're big and strong, et cetera, et cetera. So we're looking at the way that the messaging is created and communicated. And then as part of the interdisciplinary aspect with the computer sciences, we're trying to help a machine processing algorithm understand that the way that a humanities specialist would.
Excellent, and what a great opportunity for you to collaborate with other individuals at our university. Very good. And Dr. Rankin, can you speak to this research as well and how it relates to the book that you're writing?
Yes, I can. And let me reiterate Sam's comment. Thank you so much for inviting us to this program today. It's really exciting to be talking about this work. So the work that Sam and I are doing is actually just kind of a small slice of a couple of the chapters that's coming out of a larger project that I'm very, very close to completing now, which is a general history of the coordinator's office. So this office existed from 1940 to 1945. It was led by Nelson Rockefeller, the one and only, right? The one from the famous Rockefeller family. He eventually becomes vice president of the United States. He was quite young at the time that he took over the directorship of this office. He was only 32. But he used a lot of his connections and influence in the business world and also in governing circles to pull together a very kind of inclusive program of U.S. Latin American relations and a diplomatic approach that was really quite new at the time. And so one of the things that I find really fascinating about the work that intersects so importantly with the project that Sam and I are working on is Rockefeller's office really introduced kind of what we'll refer to as kind of a softer approach to diplomacy. The United States for decades had a reputation of kind of bullying its way around Latin America, of telling Latin American leaders and governments, this is what we want you to do, and if you don't do it, we're going to invade. There were numerous instances of U.S. military occupations in Latin America in the decades prior to World War II, and that didn't actually have the kinds of effects that U.S. leaders wanted. It actually upset people quite a bit, as you might imagine. So this softer approach to diplomacy comes about with the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and that's one of the projects that's a very kind of close part of this office, is to use the war and wartime programs to initiate that softer approach. What I find fascinating is this really intersects with the use of propaganda, which is kind of an emerging professional field in the early 20th century. And so, using a kind of subtle propaganda message, sometimes they weren't so subtle, to convince people in Latin America to be friends with the United States, to join the alliance, that it's in their best interest, was a very diplomatic approach than we had seen in the past. And so all of this is really kind of coming together under that larger umbrella for me.
Thank you, Dr. Rankin. And can you kind of give the audience a bit more of a general idea? What is propaganda?
You could ask 20 different propaganda specialists that question, and you would get 20 different answers. I would say I'll kind of speak for Sam here as well, and he can let me know if he disagrees. I think that we're approaching this from a very basic definition, that this is persuasive messaging that has two intended purposes. That first intends to convince people to believe an idea, and then once that idea is held, to carry out a particular action based on that idea. And so one of the best examples that Sam kind of introduced with some of the Guardia propaganda is much of that messaging was geared toward convincing Latin Americans the United States and the Allies are going to win the war. There's the idea we want people to believe, and the action we want people to then follow up with is join our side, right? And so you see this not only in diplomacy, you see this in your daily life around you all the time. We get propaganda messaging through political campaigns. We get propaganda messaging every day coming from the White House press room. We get propaganda messaging every time we turn on the television and there's an advertisement trying to convince us that the latest and greatest product is going to solve all of our problems. There's the idea we're supposed to believe, and then we need to buy that product. There's the action we're supposed to follow it up with.
So I see passion in this topic. It oozes from you. Can you tell us how you became so interested in studying propaganda?
Sure. Probably like most academics, this topic actually has its origins in my graduate school research. My PhD dissertation topic looked specifically at World War II propaganda campaigns in Mexico. And through that research, I looked at the type of messaging campaigns created by various different entities, the Mexican government, private interest groups in Mexico, and also this agency from the United States. And what I found really notable, well, a couple of things. One, kind of the underlying motivations of the propaganda campaigns really varied depending on who was creating that propaganda. There was always kind of a basic objective, but then there was kind of an underlying objective to it as well. And, that's going to be a very different story for propaganda being generated by the Mexican government versus propaganda being generated by the US government. And so that was kind of the focus of the initial research that got me into this field. But in doing that research, it occurred to me that try as hard as I could, there just was not a lot of scholarly work that had been done on Rockefeller's office. There were a few studies that had looked at very specific pieces of the office, very particular programs that his office had helped to coordinate, most of them looking specifically at things like film and art exhibits and things that were kind of fun to dabble in some of the cultural expressions. But no one had really taken a holistic view of all of the programs, the full scope of what this office was about. And they had their hands in everything. They had their hands in generating what we would clearly identify as propaganda messages, but they were also involved in setting up trade deals and helping to secure transportation lines between the United States and Latin America. They were involved in creating public health programs and agricultural development and food supply programs, things that we don't look at as propaganda on the surface, but the underlying message coming out of those programs was not too dissimilar from the messages we see coming out of Guardia.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, sir. And the question that I have for you is, can you tell us about the nature of propaganda campaigns in this age today of fake news?
Yeah, that's one of the parallels that I see that I'm really, really excited to spend more time, I guess, thinking and talking about is how much of what we're calling propaganda, either then or now, is about controlling the message. And we can see this historically in several different moments. Before the 24-hour news cycle of CNN, there was still a great political concern with controlling the news cycle. A big story that makes an administration look good might be front page news on Monday morning, so you have the whole week to talk about it, and faux pas and bad news is going to be in the Friday evening edition that nobody reads anyway. Now we're living in a moment where there's so many different platforms and so many different voices that are happening simultaneously, and to us it seems to be such a dramatic shift. We're hitting a lot more of these notes of fake news, because what we're seeing happening in the propaganda messaging of various groups, be it a small coalition, be it a community group, be it a world government, be it a group of governments, is that we're just simply trying to get control of the message out there and perpetuate the message. And to me, the thing that I find most fascinating is that this label of fake news is not a new label. I was really struck a couple of semesters ago, and that's kind of what launched me into spending so much time looking at propaganda, by an article that came out at the dawn of the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. Banner headline saying that the stories in 2 other newspapers the day before were, quote, fake news. And it's indicative to me of a moment of when the world feels like it's in crisis or in shift. And those are things that rise and fall. And I think that we're at one of those critical moments of rise right now. And so it can feel very unsettling.
Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Rankin, what trends do you see now that you've seen historically taken place with your research?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that I would point out, and I may have a couple of students from my propaganda studies class in the audience today, so they may find some of this familiar, but I would preface this by saying the strategies really don't change. One of the things that Sam and I are doing with the Guardia data set is we are analyzing the messaging strategies in terms of long-established propaganda theory that provides us with a series of devices that propagandists use. And Sam's mentioned a couple of them: bandwagon, right? Everyone join our side, get on the side of the good guys. Name calling, they're catchy, insulting names that catch on. Using testimonial devices of, a famous person or a respected person relaying a message to try to convince people to believe an idea and carry out an action. So there's a whole series of devices that Sam and I are using to analyze our propaganda data set. And the more we dig into 1940s propaganda, the more evident it is that those devices are interacting with the communication in our lives constantly, day to day, even still now. So I think that there's a lot of consistency in the strategies that are being put into propaganda messaging. Of course, the platforms change. So in World War I, there were very incipient efforts at creating propaganda campaigns. A lot of that went through radio and then, of course, print media. By the time you get to World War II, film was a very well-developed media. Theaters, film houses were in existence throughout the United States and throughout Latin America, for that matter. So propaganda films with moving images and visuals to reinforce the message were not a brand new technology, but certainly making a bigger impact in propaganda messaging than it had in previous decades. Of course, I think most of us can realize today that in the internet age, right, we are in the midst of being inundated with messaging through social platforms, through memes that are shared. Probably one of the most prolific forms of day-to-day propaganda during the most recent political campaign were in the form of political memes. And because that platform has developed in recent decades, the creators of propaganda are also kind of in a period of transition. You know, decades ago, I couldn't create a strong propaganda campaign on my own without some kind of powerful and wealthy institution behind me that had the means to create broad-scale messaging and to disseminate it with a lot of legitimacy behind it and influence behind it to a large population. Now, you know, I can use my Twitter account, and, you know, if it gets picked up by, you know, the right followers and goes viral, so to speak, you know, here just kind of ordinary college professor could potentially be engaging in a propaganda campaign. And that's, you know, and people always have done this, right? The water cooler talk that people would, you know, discuss the new ideas of, did you hear that smoking's bad for you? I think you should probably put that cigarette out, right? That's all part of kind of a propaganda messaging, but the reach is pretty limited without this new technology that we have today. So it kind of a long answer to what was kind of a simple question. That's a couple of the things that I would point to.
Fantastic. No, and I appreciate the historical background and bringing us up to date and where we are today. And I invite Sam to entertain the question of, what direction do you think propaganda will go?
Well, you know, I've been thinking about this this question actually for a little while now. It's difficult because I think there's probably a historical model that suggests that propaganda and our reactions to it will normalize. One of the examples that I'm fond of bringing up to anybody who will listen to me is that when the printing press came out, it was a scary piece of technology. So there were lots of people up in arms about people being able to print in not Latin and to say whatever they wanted. And I see that being the case with, or very similar emotionally to our reactions to Twitter or Parler or whatever platform that is out there and creating a community. But it's this idea of community creation that I think is going to be fundamental for the next several years as far as what propaganda is and does, because our society at this moment is also dealing with this dramatic rupture that we've been living through for the past year of quarantine, lockdown, social distancing, don't see your grandchildren or your mom and dad. And so communities are forming in meaningful and different ways more and more and more in the electronic and digital space. So I honestly can't say if that's going to precipitate it normalizing more quickly or if it's going to precipitate it feeling even crazier for the short term. So that's a terrible answer to your question, but I'm really fascinated to find out what happens.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And Sam, I do have another question specifically for you. Can you tell us about whether or not there is any value in the repetition and framing of propaganda messages. You know, we have social media accounts right now, and when one thing picks up, we could say hashtag trending now, right? So is there any value in the repetition of propaganda messages?
Yes, I think absolutely. And this is fundamentally true, not just in our advertising and social media, but in perhaps this will come off polemically, and I don't mean it this way, but think of how we educate our children in school and in our private lives and in our faiths. We repeat messaging over and over again. We come up with mantras and phrases, and the kinds of language that becomes emblematic of our community and our greater beliefs and our long-term goals, and the way that that is strengthened is through the repetition. Another example, one of the most common things one will hear at an Alcoholics or Narcotics Anonymous meeting is "keep coming back." And that's always the punctuation to whatever messaging is going on. Now, that messaging is all thematically about persevering and doing and following your course and meeting your goals, and it's punctuated by this repeated, well, this refrain, keep coming back. So I believe that the repetition is one of the most under-discussed elements of propaganda messaging that I've been really excited to work with Dr. Rankin on, kind of developing how that is outside of what we would call like the normal devices of propaganda. Repetition is your bread and butter of how you get the propaganda done.
Thank you very much, Sam. Now, Dr. Rankin, I know that you all wanted to discuss the Spire Grant research a little bit. Did you want to go ahead and share that now? Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on?
Sure, and Sam might actually have some follow-up comments because he's got his hands in the Spire Grant day to day, and then I get to oversee it. So the Spire Grant, this is a really fantastic program out of the Office of Research, which of course you're aware of, to provide seed money for interdisciplinary research programs with a preference for disciplines that might not work together ordinarily. So here we are as historians working with computer science, which is very exciting as far as I'm concerned. So we're working with a professor of computer science, Vincent Ng, and his team of research assistants. And we are essentially kind of constructing a labeling model, if you will, of what we see as historians, as kind of humanists, in the propaganda messaging in our data set. And we feed that to the computer scientists who then work their magic and create algorithms. And the goal is to be able to teach the computer to analyze this messaging in the same way that we do, to identify which devices are being used in this messaging and how effectively are they being put to use. Sam and I have also come up with a list of what we're calling our propaganda tactics that work in concert with the devices. And so Sam was just talking about repetition, and that's also my favorite of the tactics. You know, if you have a name calling device, the repetition of that name calling over and over and over again will actually make people absorb it. Sometimes people start to repeat it, and it becomes a very effective tactic to kind of pair with that device. So our intent is to be able to provide this information to the computer scientists who can then teach this computer to think about propaganda the way that Sam and I are.
And thank you, Dr. Rankin. Did you want to go ahead and weigh in, Sam?
Yeah, if I may. Along those lines, I just wanted to take an opportunity for those of any of the undergraduates that are here and listening. The Spire Grant is actually looking for bilingual readers right now, because, as I mentioned earlier, part of our analysis is a historical Spanish language publication. So what we are looking for are readers who can work comfortably in reading Spanish to go in and start identifying these moments of propaganda messaging devices and tactics. How often is this idea repeated? Oh, this is a big bandwagon argument, or this is a strong testimonial, or whatever. So I just encourage those who are here and listening, if you're interested, please reach out. And I am so sorry, Dr. Rankin, maybe you can help me about where the link can be found for that job posting, because I can't remember off the top of my head.
That it's actually, the job is, it's a student worker position that we're hiring for the end of spring semester and possibly even into the summer for people who can read Spanish fluently. And that posting is in the Career Center's, I forgot the name of it now, the Career Center's job posting service, which is Handshake. Thank you. Or anyone can reach out directly to me with an email, but any formal applications have to go through Handshake through the Career Center. But that job posting is open at least through the end of this week. And we're really excited to bring on additional readers to kind of test our own approach to what we think we're seeing in the propaganda messaging.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We do have questions in the queue from the audience. And the first question is, what's the difference or the line between propaganda and marketing or advertising or public relations techniques?
I can go ahead and take that question. Again, I think if you asked 20 different propaganda specialists, you would get 20 different answers to that question. For me personally, that line is not very definitive. Because all of those fields are intended to persuade. They're intended to persuade you to believe an idea and then to act on that idea. So if it's supporting your government in a war, that's one outcome of persuasion. If it's buying the coolest new pair of Nikes, that's another outcome of persuasion, right? That's still a belief these are the greatest shoes ever, and an action, I'm going to buy them. That propagandists want you to perform. I think that frequently, and this is what I run into sometimes with the classes that I teach, we automatically registered the word propaganda in a very negative way. And it has become an incredibly loaded term over the course of the 20th century because there have been a lot of really abusive applications of propaganda messaging. We tend to hear about propaganda in a really derogatory way when it's the enemy doing it in wartime, or if it's the opposing political party in the midst of a political campaign. And so it has taken on a lot of really negative connotations. But I think that because at its very kind of inherently, propaganda is about persuasive messaging, there are a lot of applications of propaganda that I think a lot of people would agree bring about a really an amazing kind of social good. And the best current example is wear a mask, get a COVID vaccine, right? These are public health propaganda messages that if this helps to eradicate COVID, I think a lot of us would agree that's a really good use of propaganda. Now, a lot of people don't like masks and don't believe in the science of vaccines. And for those people, that might be really evil propaganda, right? And so I think that it's those negative connotations I find to be kind of unfortunate because it kind of obscures our ability to approach studying that messaging in an objective way.
Thank you, Dr. Rankin. Additional questions in the queue from the audience. Will it be impossible to control fake news? It seems like there's so many people believing anything that they throw at them without really thinking about it twice or doing research. Sam, would you like to entertain that?
Oh, yeah, I would. And not because I have a great answer for it, but because that just touches on such an urgent concern for so many of us who live in the moment and see people that we know and love and would otherwise respect coming up with ridiculous conclusions based on really bad evidence. This really, ironically, is kind of a touchstone of a very important historical debate in propaganda studies, or in really governance studies. It's called the Lippmann-Dewey debate about, is it the citizens' job to educate themselves, or is it the media's job to educate the citizenry? And it's paradoxical. I understand the concern. I'm equally as concerned as anybody. However, I think what we have is a bit of a tempest in a teapot as well. And that's perhaps too dismissive to say it that way. But what I think we have is too much proximity to the circumstance to realize that there are more rational people with whom you do not interact than there are irrational people who make a lot of noise. So I think the way that it gets fixed is we all take a breath and we continue making our own gardens green and promoting our good messaging, which, if I could just go off on a little tangent here, the propagandists will answer the previous question that there is no difference between propaganda and marketing, because the propagandist believes they're telling the truth and they believe their job is to disseminate good information to the people. And a marketer believes they want to give good information about their product. So in a lot of ways, studying propaganda isn't about studying truth, it's about studying cajoling and coercion and consent. So I'd just add that in there, and now I will shut up. Thank you so much.
No, not at all. I appreciate everything that you commented on, but I do have an additional add-on question to send your way. And that is, once fake news or propaganda has been disseminated and the public has taken a stance on whether or not they're going to buy in, so to speak, can it be reversed?
I think perhaps it can be, but at great cost. I think this is an anecdotal response, but instinctively, I've known several people who voted for Nixon twice, who 20 years later are willing to admit that they're really sad they did that. And so I think that's one of those time heals all wounds things, depending on how deeply held the belief is in the moment of action, which gets back to a point Dr. Rankin was mentioning about a propaganda campaign does want you to believe and then act. Barring being able to convince you to believe, we at least want you to act. But really, ideally, I want you to believe, and then from that belief, do the things I want you to do.
Can I add a quick comment to that as well? Because I think it's really worth pointing out that propaganda messaging is intended to play on our emotions. It's really not intended to play on our rational thought. Now, there is some propaganda that enters into rational arguments. Wearing a mask, for example, we often get a lot of scientific information about why that's good for us, right? But the most sophisticated propaganda is able to do that in a way that tugs at some kind of an emotional core that we have. And so it's really difficult to be able to predict how emotionally someone's going to respond once they've bought into fake news, or once they've decided, no, that's fake news, I'm not going to believe it, because much of that is coming from an emotional place, and human beings are inherently difficult to predict.
Thank you, Dr. Rankin. And I'm going to swing back around to a question related to propaganda in Latin America. Since Latin America was mostly dictatorships, would it matter what public opinion in Latin America thought about either supporting the Axis or the Allies?
I can address that to some extent. So during World War II, you're probably talking about half and half of Latin American countries that are under control of what we consider a dictator versus a country that was governed by a somewhat democratic administration or institution. And at the end of the day, propagandists in the United States government understood that their first priority in a propaganda audience were the decision makers. So a lot of their messaging, and Guardia is a really good example of this. This is a magazine that was printed monthly, very high quality, and distributed to people that the coordinator's office considered the quote unquote opinion makers. And so this was political leaders, this was business leaders, people in influential positions, the socialites of local society. There were other campaigns that were geared toward what we might call the masses, right? More ordinary folks. But ultimately, these propagandists understood those who are making the formal decisions of the position that government is going to take, they're our first priority. And that was the urgency of the wartime situation. There's kind of an underlying hope within this office that they can generate some goodwill over the course of the wars, the years of the war, so that following World War II, they can maintain a better relationship diplomatically with Latin America. So the information that was kind of targeted to the ordinary folks had that in mind. I would dare to say they weren't entirely successful in doing that, largely because the Roosevelt administration ended right about the time the war was ending with Roosevelt's death. And new administrations came into office with new priorities and new sense of urgency, particularly about the Cold War and the role that Latin America could potentially play in it. And so the bullying kind of returns, right? But there is very much this understanding, and it's a very pragmatic approach that these people took. This is our first priority. This is the urgency. We need to have this area of the world that's in our neighborhood, right? This is the Western Hemisphere. Mexico has a 2,000-mile border with us. You know, the Panama Canal is a defensive strategic point in the Western Hemisphere. We can't have any of these people joining the side of the axis. So that's the first priority. And then hopefully, maybe we should call this the trickle-down effect. I don't want to cite Reaganomics too much, but maybe some of that will also make its way down to the opinions of the general populace.
Thank you, Dr. Rankin. I do have another question from the audience. Were there any missteps by the OIAA in their messaging to Latin American audiences during World War II that maybe illustrate U.S.-Latin American relations at the time?
Sam, would you like to take this one?
Yeah. Well, I can speak to a glaring one that I'm aware of, specifically in Guardia. The early interest of the United States at the outset of this publication was to convince the peoples of Latin America that the Allies were going to win, and the way that and also to combat Axis propaganda that had been occurring in the region, or that they believed had been predominant in the region. So a lot of their messaging had to do with what I've mentioned earlier as a bandwagon argument, get on board with us, but they communicated that messaging by showing lots and lots and lots of big scary guns and lots of reach, and says, you know, we can get from the southern point of Chile all the way up to Japan instantaneously, and our radios cover the entire hemisphere and nobody can hide from us. Well, that's great as far as saying, wow, those guys sure are strong, but they're targeting the decision makers and leaders in countries who have in their lifetime memories of when that power and mass was pointed at their own country. So they did a lot of maybe some soul searching, and there is a shift in the way that their messaging is conveyed, and they start really toning down the we're strong and violent and bellicose to more like, hey, we're all buddies here, and look, we've got refrigeration and tasty ice cream and things that we want to trade and share back and forth. So that would be one that I could point out.
Thank you very much. We have two other questions from the audience that we are going to be able to address today before we close out our program. And the first one is, would the presenters agree that the First Amendment may be the best tool for combating fake news or propaganda? Well, would either of you like to entertain that?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because sure, I think that you could get the First Amendment behind combating fake news, but the First Amendment also can be used in defense of people's rights to say what they want to say, right? So I think that one of the reasons that we have so much disinformation and we see so much of it now with access to social media is, I mean, the First Amendment protects speech on both sides. So I don't know. That's a pretty tough one. I don't know if Sam has any thoughts on that one.
Yeah. I think I might be a little bit of a jaded person, maybe, because I would say the First Amendment is one of those things that makes propaganda a really sticky thing to fix. But in that same breath, I'm going to say that it's not a problem so much. And so if we really want to kind of get creative with the question, I would say the right to free association and assembly guaranteed by the First Amendment is one of the best things that can be done to combat the effects of propaganda, because a propaganda campaign in its most insidious manifestation is going to make you believe that the world is in such a way and it is inevitable. And free association and meeting new people and dialogue across cultures and life experiences and paradigms is one of the most important things to combat entrenched myopic worldviews.
Excellent. Now, the final question for today relates to some of your current research and your collaborative research. What applications do you envision for a computer system that can identify and analyze propaganda? And do you think it could lead to higher integrity among news outlets?
I think that there's a lot of potential there, and every social media outlet, every traditional media outlet, and even other organizations. Dr. Ng and I have actually talked to different offices within the Department of Defense. There's a lot of interest in kind of real world applications, and you have a lot of investments already being made into trying to find a digital way to detect propaganda and respond to it. So I think that the detection of it is kind of where we are right now. And my interest is not just detecting that propaganda is at work, but how, right? What devices are being used, and are they being used effectively? And once we're able to do that and get some computer assistance doing that, especially for kind of large quantities of information, I think it could potentially open up a lot of options in terms of how different organizations can respond to that.
Well, Dr. Rankin and Sam, I want to thank you for being on our program today to share valuable information with our community. Interested in attending this or any other Office of Research event? Additional information can be found at research.utdallas.edu. Thank you.